Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest in my virtual town hall series. My name is Joe Gravellese. I'm a candidate for State Representative in the 16th Suffolk District in the Democratic primary. So that's Revere, Chelsea, and Saugus. And who better to have as a special guest than a fellow candidate for State Rep, but in a different district, the 29th Middlesex, Steve Owens. Hi, Steve. How you doing?
Hey, Joe. I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm glad we can talk about our experiences. So, yeah, I am a candidate for state representative, same as you, open seat, first-time candidate. My district is the 29th Middlesex, which is most of Watertown, about 3/4 of Watertown, and then west and parts of North Cambridge. So just two communities, but it's been it's been fun to get to know them.
Yeah. So what made you decide to jump into the race, and tell people that maybe aren't that are in my constituency, a little bit about you and why you decided to run?
Yeah, sure. So I was I've been the chair of the Watertown Democratic Town Committee for about 12 years. I've been, pushing progressive candidates and progressive causes in town, building coalitions, building communities, fighting for progressive change for about 15 years now. And when our state representative Jonathan Heck stepped down, I decided that the best thing for me was to continue that fight in the legislature. You can fight in the party and have intra-party conversations all you want, but to get real progress and real change happen, that happens in government, in the legislature. So professionally, I'm a transportation consultant. My passion is, the environment and the outdoors, and those are really two issues that we've seen right now are so important. And the legislature is doing their work now, but there's always going to be more work to do going forward. And
Right.
Why don't you tell my people a little bit about yourself, as long as we're introducing each other?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Revere native. And I spent a few years working at the State House, actually. So I worked for Representative Lori Ehrlich, a longtime endorsee of environmental groups and passionate about environmental causes. So I worked as our legislative director. So we worked on legislation tackling gas leaks. We worked on legislation transitioning Massachusetts away from coal and shutting down the polluting Salem coal plant. And also on some labor and workforce development issues, including protecting workers from exploitative non-compete agreements. I moved on from there to go work back in my home city of Revere, where I worked for Mayor Brian Arrigo for the first 2 years of his first term, working on the Substance Use Disorder Initiatives Office in Revere. It was a key initiative that I worked on, reforming the city's Commission on Disabilities, and also improving constituent services by launching a 311 system, which we somehow did not have yet in Revere until 2016. So we kind of started to catch up with the times a little bit. After that, I went to work at my alma mater, Boston College, and I've been taking some grad school classes and figuring out what comes next, and decided to take a stab at running for office. Much like you, I've been active in the Democratic City Committee here in Revere, and seeing the opportunity to really talk about these important issues like transportation, like education, like the environment. I thought this was a really important year to talk about these issues and push for the kind of changes that we need to see in the legislature.
Yeah, and I think these things are so important now, especially since we have we've suffered a certain neglect, and worse than neglect, from the federal government for the past 4 years.
Right.
If there's something that could be worse than neglect, that's what we've got.
Right. Yeah.
Actively making things worse.
Yeah, neglect would be a step up. And one thing that I never foresaw was running a campaign in the middle of a global pandemic. And that's one thing that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, is kind of share some experiences. I announced my campaign on March 9th. I believe it was either March 8th or March 9th. And then that Wednesday was the day that the NBA shut down and everything shut down. So pretty much my entire campaign has been in the specter of COVID. And that's done two things. First of all, it obviously changes the way you campaign, which I want to hear, about how that's shaped you. And also it's shaped the issues a lot too. I think obviously in a lot of ways, COVID has only amplified existing challenges that we already knew were there, in terms of inequality, in terms of public health and environmental challenges. But it's also changed the way we talk about these issues too. So I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, what has campaigning in the age of a global pandemic looked like for you?
Yeah, well, it's a very similar situation. I started my campaign a little bit earlier. I started in February. So I was able to, go out into the world a little bit. For the Democratic presidential primary, I was out there knocking on doors and collecting signatures in person. But even then, I remember when I was out collecting signatures, what was that, March 3rd?
Yeah.
People were like, I don't know if I should take your pen. I'll bring my own pen. So people are starting to think about, and everything happened so quickly.
Right.
We had, after the primary, we had our Watertown Democratic Town Committee. We had like 150 people all coming in, the same, room, auditorium, just kind of hanging out there, doing the caucus. And we had a little, hand sanitizer, and we had, your own pens, and everyone was kind of knew about it, but wasn't really taking it seriously. And then the next day was a Cambridge caucus, and people were taking it a lot more seriously. There was a sanitation station with gloves and everything. And then the next day, everything was canceled. I just remember it happening so quickly. But you're right. The issues that I was talking about beforehand are still important. The issues of the environment and transportation. But when we started this, we had a transportation crisis, a congestion nightmare. I'm sure I don't have to tell you in Revere, it's no better out here in the western side, right? So when nobody was on the road because everybody was locked down in their house, nobody was really that interested in talking about the MBTA. Right. People were not interested in congestion pricing, for example.
Right.
But to your point, the pandemic really has brought to the fore and made people think about the inequalities that had existed before COVID. Right. And it really, I think it opened a lot of people's eyes. I mean, we sort of knew that these things were happening. We knew that, people in, Chelsea and for example, were living in kind of conditions that were made worse by, asthma and crowding. But, to see it in stark numbers, really made people think more about these issues of justice, about environmental justice, like where are we citing these polluting generating facilities, right? Where are we running these highways through? How long are we letting these trucks idle for? That sort of thing. So that really opened people's eyes to a lot of inequalities, and then of course in the middle of that, the Black Lives Matter and the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so on really put to the forefront these issues of social justice, environmental justice, educational justice, and that's really been something that's been on everybody's mind as I talk to them throughout this pandemic. Yeah, no, and I think that obviously we were no strangers here in this district in Chelsea and Revere to the inequities that existed before COVID, and I kind of liken the attention that communities like Chelsea are starting to receive now statewide, where it's kind of like when I think about the issue of gas leaks, nobody thinks about it. It's not sexy to think about the fact that every single day methane's leaking out of the pipes and it's causing pollution and it's contributing to climate change and it's making us sick and it's costing us all money. But you don't think about it because you can't see it. So it's just kind of out of the way, but then it blows up. Right. Then boom. Okay. That's when you notice it. And that's when you realize that you have to take action. And I think that's kind of how I feel about the situation, and to some extent Revere, but especially Chelsea, where you had decades of broken housing policy that led to people living in overcrowded conditions, decades of sort of de facto segregation too, which congests a lot of essential workers and communities of color and low income people into small spaces, and just sort of unequal access to opportunity, which has ended up putting a lot of people behind the eight ball in communities like Chelsea. It gives them a tough situation. And so now we've had our, public health equivalent of the Merrimack Valley gas explosion, where it's easy to ignore when you don't see it on TV, and now you see it on TV. You see the illness and death that happened. You see the people lining up at food banks. You see the people that are desperate for rental assistance, for housing assistance, and it's making people around the state stop and think, well, how did we get here? And what can we do to use this as a moment to do better moving forward? And I think we'll talk about that as we move through when we talk about policies. But, one thing that I think I'm sure is on both of our mind is how COVID itself and the
situation that we find ourselves in, where we don't have in-person events. We can't really go door to door. We can't have big rallies. You can't go shaking hands at the county fair. All the things that you think about doing that are retail politics are totally out the window. And so what has it been like for you trying to spread your message, spread the word, and talk about these issues, in the age of COVID?
It's been a lot of this. It's been a lot of this sitting here in the command center, trying to get people on the phone. We've been doing phone banks. We've been trying to get people's attention that way. We've done some town halls on issues and policies similar to what you're doing. I think a lot of candidates have tried to generate internet content that way. And I was telling you before, I did a can't knock on doors. Really think that you don't want to put anybody behind on the other side of the door in danger, and I certainly don't want to put like volunteers in danger. Going. The last thing you want to be is like the Johnny Appleseed of COVID to be your campaign, right? I mean, that's the last thing that happens is you get contact tracing comes back to somebody, and then finds out it's your volunteer that was knocking on the door spreading this around. So, but I've done some. I was out earlier in Cambridge doing rather than ring the bell, call on the phone from the driveway. And if people are comfortable coming out, I got my mask on, they got their mask on, and we have a conversation. Otherwise, it's the same as a phone bank. But it does get me some fresh air, which is nice.
Yeah. And so what I've been doing is, I'll walk around with my literature and leave it outside. But if people happen to be out, maybe walking the dog or watering the lawn or going for a walk, then it gives me an opportunity, if they're comfortable, to have a conversation with someone, mask to mask, and be able to connect that way. But you're right. It is a lot of the phone and also a lot of digital. I think it's just become more important than ever to connect with people online, because especially as Zoom became sort of central to everyday life. Doing things like this, doing video conferencing. I remember I did my first virtual town hall on the 4th day of everyone working from home and the COVID lockdowns, and it was kind of like a totally new and interesting and unique thing. And now it's old hat. I think I've done 8 or 9 of these, but we did one about vocational and technical education and had a great guest from Alliance for Vocational and Technical Education on to talk about it. I did one about gas leaks with Lori Ehrlich. I had one about substance use disorder initiatives. So, I've tried to create content, that speaks to the issues and hopefully tries to bring issues to people. Since I can't go knock on their door, I can't see them at events. I don't have the same opportunities to connect with people. But I found those to be really helpful, because we've done a bunch as well on like housing and education policy and on COVID and other things. And having those, maybe people don't catch them when they're live, but having them as I talked to an expert on transportation. Go check it out. That's right. Oh yeah, I had Jim Aloisi on.
That's right. We both did.
Yeah. And it was great, because obviously some people watch it live, some people watch it later. You can create clips and show. And I just think also too, it's important to show the voters that you are working hard to show them what you're all about. And I think the normal way to do that is to be everywhere, right? But there's no everywhere to be. So we're all kind of making it up as we go, but I think we're both been on the same page about being really careful to make sure that we're not doing anything that's irresponsible or that's going to make anyone uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, you've knocked on doors for other candidates before, I'm sure, and when you do that, you never really know who's going to be on the other side or what their situation is, and so it's important to be mindful that you don't know who has a daughter in chemo or something like that, or who's on oxygen, or so. You just got to be really careful. I think there's a lot that can be done on through the phones, through Zoom. The one nice thing about Zoom is you never have to say, I can't go to that because I'm going to be in a different town than an hour before then. You can go. You can be in one town the meeting before, and then gotta go, and then. No travel time, I should say. Right.
Yeah. So I guess that's
you can go to more. I found that you can go to more things. Can't quite talk to as many people one-on-one, but you can at least show up there and maybe not be everywhere, but kind of watch everything. Which it's not exactly the same, but at least you people know you're there and appreciate that you showed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think one thing that, after the first few weeks, it became clear that at a certain point we had to flip the switch and just figure out a strategy and go with it, because the work goes on and legislating goes on. The State House has had an incredibly busy year. They have had a lot of important issues on their plate, ones that predated COVID, and then also ones that relate to, and address COVID issues specifically. And so the urgency couldn't let up from people like us that, we are trying to talk about these critical issues, and it's really more important than ever to talk about the issues and talk about policy. So, trying to find a way to do it, doing the best we can and make it do. But I did want to take some time to talk about, when we planned this, we thought that it would be the end of the legislative session.
Right.
Because, traditionally, the legislative session ends on July 31st of the election year, and that's the last day for bills to pass. And if any business that's not done by then, it's dead for that session, and try again in January when the new legislature comes in. But I think the legislature made the wise and appropriate decision to extend the session. First of all, I just feel like they often should do that, because they end up trying to juggle so many things right at the end and jam things in, and frankly, mistakes get made. I've seen that happen. But also, they really did shut down legislating for about a month or so, in the height of COVID, and tried to figure out how to do sessions remotely. And so all these important bills around transportation, around climate, around technology, got shelved for a bit. And now, of course, we're dealing with the fact that the state budget is totally out of whack, and we don't really know what to expect in terms of support from the federal government. So they made the wise decision to extend the session. So this won't be a recap, but it will be a
precap, maybe.
A precap and a check-in sort of on how things are going so far. And
yeah.
I guess I'd start by talking about the issue that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is transportation.
Sure.
And I think, transportation policy is really one of those things that started to light my fire about wanting to run and wanting to create change in the legislature, because, I was a staffer in 2015 when Snowmageddon happened.
Oh, okay.
And, the commuter rail got shut down and the subway got shut down, and, we had scores of angry constituents, rightly, and I was angry too, as someone who, I ride the bus, I ride the train. But I could palpably sense in that building, and this is no dig on anyone, I love a lot of the people that I worked with, but there just wasn't a lot of political will or interest in that issue.
Yeah.
I could feel it. I felt like it was a different world, like the people that ride the T and care about it, and the people that don't, and it was like never the twain shall meet. And there was no understanding of the fact that without a functioning public transportation system, we don't have a functioning economy in Greater Boston. You just can't do it. Now, of course, COVID has changed the transportation conversation in a different way, which is we have this sort of pause in our regional traffic nightmare, and we don't know when it's going to come back. It's fair to suspect that it will eventually, but we have this real opportunity to think about, like, how can we do better? How can we address some of these problems that were staring us down? And, before COVID, the House did pass a transportation bill, which I'd love to get your take on.
Sure.
Post-COVID, the Senate passed its own version. So now they're working out in conference committee what that's going to look like. But why don't you give me your take a little bit on those two bills and, where they made the strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, well, the House did two things. They did a transportation bond bill, which is to generate the funding, or at least authorize the funding for a bunch of the projects, which is important. I mean, you have to authorize the funding, otherwise you don't get the funding. But it also means that, that's money that's ready to be, well, not necessarily ready to be spent, but authorized to be spent. And it still needs to actually, the administration will still actually need to spend it. So it's great that it's done, but that's not, necessarily money that we can count on, especially if the budget is in shambles for a long time, right? So the transportation bond bill was great. The Senate, I think, went more in that direction rather than the transportation funding bill, which is what the other bill the House passed, which is the one that the Senate didn't really want to touch. And I really thought that the transportation funding bill had a lot of good things in it. We know, living in Greater Boston, that the MBTA needs more support. It needed more support, in 2015, it's Snowmageddon. It needed more support during the derailments. Was that last year? I can't keep track of time anymore.
No, I think it was last year.
Completely removed my ability to tell how long things have been, but I'm pretty sure that was last year. It needs support now to make sure that we can, run that people feel safe to ride the MBTA. Right? We need to have a system that is frequent enough so that it prevents crowding, so that people feel more comfortable that they can social distance, that everybody's wearing a mask, but if you're still jammed in like sardines, you can feel very unsafe in this sort of environment. So yes, the MBTA needs funding, and having those funding sources was very important. And so those sources were a raise on the gas tax and on diesel, a little bit higher on diesel, which I think is completely appropriate. I think the gas tax still is not extremely low, but it's in the low range when you compare it with other states. And honestly, in the COVID world, when so few people were driving, the price of oil, we all joked about it. It turned negative. They had to pay people to get away. So I don't know about you, but I've never seen gas prices this low since the 90s. So
yeah, I think the bigger issue to me is they did creep up a little bit, but
right.
Look, I'm sensitive always to the fact that we need to make sure that any revenue that we raise is done in a progressive way, and that's why I did like that the bill also did include some changes to sort of passive income and corporate taxes. That's the other thing that I wanted to, because I'll let you do that. I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah. So the corporate the corporate minimum tax. Changing that from a flat $465. And when I tell people that, they think I'm joking, that the corporate minimum tax is only for, no matter what revenue of your size of your company is, $465 is the minimum that you pay. So changing that to a tiered system, I think that other states have, was something that was very smart.
Right.
The other thing,
you don't want to crush the small businesses.
No, not at all.
Right. Exactly.
No, tier it on, especially now, when so many small businesses are getting crushed. No, you want to keep it low for small businesses.
Right.
But Amazon should be paying more than $465.
Right. Like we have, Amazon just opened a facility in Revere. It is contributing tax revenue to the community, but in terms of corporate tax, $465 seems a little low for a company like Amazon to be paying. Yeah,
and Jeff Bezos is on his way to becoming the world's first trillionaire. Right. So I think that they can open their checkbook a little bit more, to especially when people are struggling, and when Amazon especially relies on our transportation network, more than a lot of companies, right? So that was one of the other funding things they did. And I will, respond. We do want to make sure, the gas tax is regressive, And I think that, if I had, if we had to do it in a way that was more equitable for not just income levels, but also regionally. I've had, there are people around here can take the tea. Say, gas is too expensive. I'll take the tea, right? But people out in rural areas don't have that option, and they're driving longer. Maybe not longer in terms of time, but certainly longer in terms of miles. I know it takes me a half hour sometimes or used to anyway, to get downtown, and you can go a lot further on a half hour out in Western Mass. But so if there's ways that we can balance that. Offset it. One of the things that I really think is important, especially now, is helping communities, especially in Western Mass, with their internet. Municipal broadband is something that we can really use, because we're a lot of us are working from home. If we can get people to work from home, 1 day a week, 2 days a week, or something like that. That takes cars off the road. That reduces their people's fuel spend too. So if we can do trade-offs like that, I think that makes a lot of sense, because we do need to reduce the amount of pollutants, amount of carbon that we put into our atmosphere. That means we need to put a price on it. So if we can do that, it's revenue neutral or that is offset by some other advantage, I think that's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned municipal broadband. I know it wasn't quite on our radar, but it's kind of become a pet issue for me because
it's a transportation issue, sure. Communication.
I mean, transportation and telecommuting issues are kind of interconnected now because
absolutely.
That's the big question when we think about what are our transportation needs going to be. It's how much is telecommuting going to stay with us moving forward? Are we going to kind of move back towards the old normal? And how is that going to influence sort of travel patterns and things like that?
Yeah.
But on municipal broadband, one of the things that kind of boggled my mind in the immediate weeks as COVID started to sort of tear through us and people started doing more work from home and schooling from home is, you had these grandiose press releases from, municipal officials about, Comcast is offering internet essentials to people for like $10 a month or whatever during the pandemic. But of course, it took exactly 1 month for there to be stories about them using this as a backdoor to rip people off. They forgot that they were actually eligible for the income waiver and they got billed more and taken to collections, or, it's not available in certain areas, or, all these other roadblocks that were thrown up and put in the way. And let's be honest, like, you wouldn't expect anything other than that from Comcast, right? They're not exactly known for their customer service. But then also, like, I say this all the time, I don't expect private entities to act out of benevolence, right? Like, that's not their job. Right. So if we are looking for something that's done in the public interest, then it's something that we need to figure out how to do together, and that's where municipal broadband comes in, especially in communities where there's an internet gap, particularly in more rural communities. It's not quite as necessary, where the infrastructure is a little bit more built out, but it's still something that we should look at because we all know that internet is essential now. It's essential to do business. It's essential for school. It's essential for connecting to jobs. And so we can't really leave that to the whims of, what Comcast is willing to offer people. So
and I think in areas where it, population is a little bit denser, we have an opportunity to do some interesting things with, municipal Wi-Fi and public Wi-Fi networks and things like that. In Cambridge, they were doing things to help kids get on the internet once the schools moved online. They were setting up like hotspots and things like that in places where they had a large number of students who didn't really have reliable access to the internet. Because that's the other thing, my wife works from home. I work from home. 2 kids on Zooms. The internet's not a truck; it's a series of tubes. You gotta make sure you have those tubes large enough to fit all that data through it, right?
That's a good reference. So Rita pointed out, the internet should be a utility, and that's exactly right. It's as essential now as electricity and as water. We have to have it, and so cities and towns and states should be looking into how do we make sure that people can access it affordably and reliably. So I'm glad that we mentioned that. But on transportation, just real quick, we've taken a little bit more time on this than I planned, but who cares? That's the other good thing about the internet. It's not like column inches. We can use as much of it as we want. I always like to tell people, pre-COVID, but the traffic nightmares that we live with are a choice. And the housing crisis that sort of comes with that is a choice. It was our policy choice that, like, you have a very small number of neighborhoods that you can live in that have reliable transit access to jobs in Boston. And therefore, if you live in Beachmont in Revere or near Wonderland Station in Revere or in Chelsea, you're seeing housing prices go up and up and up because there's only, everything got expensive in downtown Boston. Everything got expensive in Jamaica Plain. Everything got expensive in Somerville, and it's just that pattern repeats itself because there's only so many places that have this transportation access, which is clearly what the demand is for. And that was a policy choice. We could have made the decision 30, 40 years ago, around when we did the big dig, that we could have also invested in a truly world-class transit system. Like, it blows people's minds that in Berlin, if you live in the equivalent of like Foxborough to the south, or a place like Beverly, or Danvers to the north, that you can take a train to downtown that runs every 15 minutes, 7 days a week. And if we had a system like that, which we have the tracks to do it because we have the commuter rail that's already there, then the amount of places that would have, sustainable development would increase. the amount of places that would be affordable and accessible, to have access to jobs in places like Boston and Cambridge would increase, and it would decrease pressures on places like where I live, and to some extent, where you live too. And this was a choice. We could have made better choices, but now we have the opportunity to make those choices. And, it's not cheap. It is expensive to do things like this. It was expensive to take our famously dirty water, there was a song about it, and clean it up and make it so that the harbor is clean and we could develop along the waterfront and have economic growth and also be able to swim in Revere Beach and have it be one of the cleanest beaches in America. Like, that was expensive, but it had a huge benefit to our quality of life. And
absolutely,
making the right choices on transportation is part of that too. And so I guess my final thing about, where we're at with House and Senate on transportation is that whatever they do, it's still a small measure towards really what we need to fix the transportation crisis that we were in pre-COVID and will likely be in again, God willing, we move to the other end of the pandemic anytime soon.
Yeah, and I will just one last thing on this, because you mentioned the rail. And I really want to put in another plug for regional rail, because the commuter rail system was got stuck in this like 1950s. The businessman goes downtown at 7:30 in the morning and comes back at 5:30 in the afternoon, and that's it. And he's he's a fictional 50s businessman. You're from the guy from Mad Men. Going to work, making a good salary, and so you can charge a lot of money for each thing. But what we really want is a commuter rail that is more flexible, more accessible to a wide variety of people, to people at all levels of income. So it's not just a couple $100 for a monthly pass. That is really outside of the range for people on the lower end of the income spectrum. So I really appreciate you bringing that part of it up as well.
Yeah, and this has a concrete impact on Revere. We have the huge traffic issue sort of along Revere Beach, and one thing that really contributes to that, if you look in the Wonderland garage every morning on a normal day, pre-COVID, around 30% of the cars parked in that garage to get on the Blue Line are from Lynn. And a number of additional cars are actually from points north of Lynn. And so they drive past the Lynn commuter rail station or other commuter rail stations like in Swampscott or along the North Shore to get to Wonderland. They drive through our roads and park there. And you can't blame people for doing it, because it's like $8.25 to ride the commuter rail into Boston, and it runs once an hour at peak times, and then it doesn't run for several hours. And then if you're coming home and you miss your train by 2 minutes, you're waiting, at North Station for an hour and a half for the next one. Whereas if you go to the Blue Line, it's, every 8 minutes or so, and it's much cheaper. So you can't blame people for making that choice. But if we made it so that it was incentivized to get on the train at Lynn, or get on the train at Swampscott, or get on the train at Salem, then that relieves a lot of the burden, on the Blue Line and along that garage. So, I could do 2 whole hours about this.
we're about to, I think.
Yeah. So let's on the page. What else do you got on your end of session docket that you want to talk about?
So we'll talk a little about the climate bill.
Sure.
That passed passed the House on Friday. So that's kind of had a long journey. There was back last year, there was a Green Works bill that the House passed that was mostly, bond and grants and money for mitigation, right? Or not for resiliency, I should say, for adaptation. So these are projects for municipalities to kind of deal with the aftermath of climate change, which is important because we have to do it, right? We have to build up those seawalls. We have to, it's important for all of us. We have, flooding over in Alewife Brook here in Cambridge, and I'm sure, you have. I don't have to tell you about sea level rise in Revere, so so I won't.
Or flood insurance, for that matter.
Yeah, right, exactly. Flood insurance. So we got a storm that's probably going to mostly miss us coming up tomorrow. So that's mercy anyway. But so we're adaptation and resiliency is important stuff. But it's not really. We need to take preventative measures, right? We need to take steps to say, all right, that's enough. We've put enough carbon in this atmosphere. Let's see how we can stop doing that for a little while. Because if we don't, we're only going to need to spend more and more and more money on these adaptive measures, and eventually it's going to be so much we're going to have to revamp our economy anyway. So let's do it now when it's I don't want to say easier, because none of this is really easy.
We kind of missed the opportunity to do it when it would be. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. So so that was in 2019. Then the Senate in January, I think, passed a great climate bill that had a lot of had a roadmap to carbon neutrality at by 2050, and they had 5-year increments, 5-year like check-ins by statute, so that there was progress. Progress was monitored, because, and I described this to a lot of people, like, climate change is not like a term paper, right? You can't write it all at the night before and hand it in. This is a process that you need to be working on throughout throughout time. You can't solve climate change by cramming and pulling an all-nighter. You need to make sure that you have milestones that are enforceable. If they're not enforceable, then what's the point? You're just going to skip over them. So it had a lot of those good things in it. It had they passed some of to go back to the transportation. They passed another bill that was MBT electrification studies and things like that. Our transportation is the plurality of our emissions come from the transportation sector. So the more we can electrify that, the less emissions will be responsible that way. So then, of course, COVID hits, and nobody's talking about anything but COVID for a while. Then the legislature, kind of has to figure out how to go forward. And I was talking to a number of House members, and they said, yeah, if COVID didn't hit, we probably would do it, but I don't know if we're gonna get to climate now. I was really kind of disappointed. So this goes back to your first to our introductory point. Thank goodness they extended the session, right? Because I think this was going to be one of those things where, yeah, everybody agrees it's important, but the world's on, the world is being consumed by COVID right now. We can't do anything that might upset the economic balance. So they extended the session, and we'll see where the conference committee heads. The House version of the bill was a little less aggressive. They wanted there were activists who wanted 100% renewables by 2030 if they could. That didn't happen, but there are some renewable standards put in. The milestones are a little bit less than the Senate version. They're every 10 years instead of every five years. So there is that term paper risk. Right. Of realizing that it's oh gosh, it's 2028. We need to get to those. Right.
It's a little bit less prescriptive in how we get there too. The Senate bill was more detailed in terms of like, here's how much the transportation sector needs to cut and the power generation, and I do ultimately think that those are important. To have those types of guardrails in there, because we've seen what happens when you sort of set a target but don't map out how you're going to get there. Yeah,
I think it is important to have some flexibility, and the Senate and House bills both, provide the administration with flexibility to set targets, or to set how you get to the targets, which is I think one of the reasons why the Senate bill passed, is because it's had a lot of language that was a little bit flexible. Right. The other important thing about the House bill is that it had this expansion of offshore wind. Which is really important because other states like New Jersey and New York are getting their claims in the water, and they're gonna the development of those wind turbines and all those jobs creating those things are going to be put where? They're not going to be put here if the waters are all off of New York and New Jersey.
Right. And when it comes to the weather patterns that we have here, we have every opportunity to be like the Denmark or Germany of North America here in Massachusetts. And we can really lead the way in the wind energy industry, where we're not only creating a lot of clean energy, which is good for the environment and good for our lungs and good for all these challenges with COVID and asthma and cancer, but also really, being at the forefront of a new industry that's going to create a lot of good working class jobs that are like middle skill jobs that you don't necessarily need a college education to make a good living doing those jobs. And we're seeing that opportunity slip out of our fingers.
And really, Joe, we've been talking about this for how long? How long have we been talking about wind off the shore of Massachusetts? And like, what the views and I don't know, and
We don't have to name names of a certain political dynasty that was on the wrong side for the record. But
we've had so long to kind of put ourselves into a place where we are kind of the crown jewel of wind generation. It would have been, we kind of wasted at least 20 years just kind of permits and this and that and so it really is a good vote of confidence here that the House has put this forward and say, no, this is the time. We're finally gonna do this, and we're gonna be serious about wind, because I think solar is great, but we need the offshore wind is gonna be really important if we want to get off of eventually natural gas, because that's where most of our electricity is now, and that's where it is during the summer when everybody's got their air conditioner on. And we're stuck on natural gas for a while, which is better than coal, but not as good as wind.
But the idea always was that it was supposed to be a bridge, but
the bridge it's got to be a bridge to go somewhere. Yeah,
it can't just be a kind of perpetual bridge that you're stuck on, and that's why one of the things that I think, and I feel you're probably kind of on the same page with me on this one, is that one thing that we really need firmer commitments from our legislators is not only to support environmental legislation, but also to kind of set a firm guideline that, no expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. We have enough of it now. We need to hold ourselves to the standard of moving towards renewable and clean energy, especially when you look at the fact that a lot of the proposed new fossil fuel infrastructures in environmental justice communities like East Boston and like Weymouth, and that leads me to one other point I wanted to make about the climate bill, which I think was a nice addition in the House bill, which was codifying environmental justice into state law, something that a lot of advocates have been pushing for a long time. In and of itself, not enough to reverse the trend of places like Chelsea and places like Revere and places like Weymouth and like East Boston being on the receiving end of a lot of pollution. But at least putting some steps in place to make sure that we're thinking harder about where these things are sited and making sure that they're not all being dumped on low-income communities and communities of color.
No, and there's definitely a advantage in having this in statute rather than just in policy.
Right.
Because now the courts can enforce it, and we can have some there can be consequences for ignoring environmental justice provisions and making sure that people in these environmental justice communities are first we have defined what that means in law, so you can't kind of like, well, is it really? No.
Right.
So now it's defined in law. You can't get away from that. And now we need to make sure that we are paying attention to where we're citing these polluting facilities, to make sure that we can make sure that we're not dumping all this bad air, particulate onto the same communities that we have been for years now.
Right, and again, like we said at the top, and that's exacerbated issues with COVID in places like Chelsea. And in places like Revere. So much appreciated, the work of the House on that. We are coming up on like 45 minutes, so maybe we can go rapid fire with
sure.
things that are on the House's plate. So the budget, they just passed a brief extension, a temporary budget rather than passing the full budget for the year, which I think was a smart move, since we are still waiting and hoping and thinking that maybe eventually Senate Republicans will wake up and realize that it's actually in their best interest to not let the states go broke and schools go broke and people go hungry. I would like to think eventually they're going to come to that realization. And while we wait for that work to continue, the House, the legislature's worked on a temporary budget for the next 3 months.
3 months.
Sort of level funds in terms of local aid and educational aid. And I think one of the things that we didn't quite get to earlier, but we're talking about the reopening of schools right now. We need to make sure that there's funding there for PPE, and funding there, if people are coming back to schools in person, which is a whole separate issue that maybe might require its own show.
I don't know if we can solve that in 15 minutes, no. But I think that's something that, honestly, I wish I've seen the schools, school committees, really struggle over this. School administrators really struggle over this. I wish they had more concrete guidance from the administration, and not just, hey, put together your plan and we'll look at your plan and tell you if it's good. And I wish they had more kind of concrete, because yeah, there are going to be different situations in each school district, but at the end of the day, somebody's going to need to decide, is it really safe to send, 20, 25, 30 kids in the same room all day? Is that really safe?
Right.
Someone's going to have to make that decision. And I don't know if we can have each superintendent make that decision and have it feel great.
Right. And I forget where I read this, but, I think this is another example, because we're not getting that clear guidance from the Commonwealth. The inequities are going to particularly hit, low-income schools, districts harder, whether it be through not having an adequate plan for doing remote learning, which is going to let more kids fall through the cracks, that don't have adequate internet access at home, or the right kind of support system to make sure that they're able to do their work remotely. Or if we do kind of rush everyone back into school, that's likelier to create more illness in places like Chelsea, where we have those existing conditions that lead to spreading incidents of COVID. So some clearer guidance, from the state, I think certainly is necessary. And I think as a general rule, I really appreciate the efforts of Mass Teachers Association, Boston Teachers Union, and other advocates in making sure that, safety comes first, and that we're looking out, for the students, for teachers, for faculty and staff, and for parents, and making sure that everything we do is done with safety in mind. So again, that could be its own show. I want to leave a few minutes. I mean, anything else that you wanted to touch on that's sort of pending as we come toward the end?
Yeah, so the police reform bill is in conference committee right now. The House and the Senate both passed their versions, and my senator Will Brownsberger is on the conference committee, and he's been very very much an advocate of the Senate package. And we'll see. I know that I've heard from senators they're getting a lot of pressure from both sides on that issue. I think the Senate bill is a little stronger on qualified immunity than the House bill. So I'd like to see that language go forward if possible. But I think it's really important that we put together these reforms in a meaningful way, something that has a little bit of teeth, something that we can take to the community and say, hey, we're moving forward on this. This isn't just the same old. This isn't just a training class and a commission. This is something that we can really have results from. And I'm hopeful that this is the time when we can do that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I try to talk about, because this is such a hot issue and people do have disagreements, and there is pressure, there's people who think that it's a weak bill and people that think that it's too much. And I think one of the things I always try to do when I talk about it with people is like, let's throw the brakes and let's realize that like 90% of what we're talking about, almost everyone agrees is like common sense. Like when you look at things like the certification and decertification at the state level of officers, where if someone gets fired from the Chelsea Police Department, that they're not going to resurface at the Lawrence Police Department or the Worcester Police Department after being, fired for misconduct. Everyone agrees with that. Not everyone. Just about everyone agrees with that. Right. Just about everyone agrees with that. That's the right thing to do. Or something like making sure that there's independent oversight and investigation, rather than DA's offices investigating police departments that they work with side by side. Kind of just removing that potential for conflict of interest. Even when I talk to people that are sort of mostly staunchly against the bill in its final form, they tend to agree that like that's smart and that's something we should do. So finding that common ground and finding those things that we generally all agree on, because it's important to not let the heated rhetoric get in the way of things that generally speaking most people agree on and think are common sense. And it's not about painting with a broad brush and saying that everyone in law enforcement is bad, because we know that that's not true. All you have to do is see some of the work that happens in our communities to know that it's not true. That being said, accountability measures where people do something wrong is something that's important, I think, in any public, any job that has the public trust: police, fire, teachers, mayors, city councilors, state representatives. If you violate that public trust, then you shouldn't get to continue drawing a public paycheck and continue to have that power and that influence. And so I think that's really what this conversation is all about. And I'm sure that, whatever the conference committee does, they're not going to make everybody happy. That's impossible.
Yeah, well,
you never do.
If there's any certainty in life, that is certainty that the conference committee won't make everybody happy. And I agree with you. I think we can come to an agreement on most of the measures in here, right. And some of the other measures are so technical that they're a little hard for maybe the layperson to understand, and they're also easy to misunderstand.
Right.
So I'm hopeful that we can get some real reforms, and even some of the common sense reforms, I think, are things that we should have had maybe a long time ago. Things like the certification and decertification, right, that are common in other states.
Yeah, and then I think my last point that I would want to make on this, and this kind of started to crystallize for me because I spent some time actually on Chelsea Public Access TV today and talking about similar issues, and I think it's important to remember that the protest movement that's happening around the country, while it was fueled by anger over incidents of police brutality, it's really not just about that. It's also about these sort of broader inequities that COVID has really laid bare. And I think it's not a coincidence that the most sustained protest movement is now, in the wake of COVID, and not when we had these previous racial flashpoints, because we've had so many of them in recent years, right? And this is really what set it off. And I think it's because it's made everyone take a much longer, harder look at things like inequities in housing, inequities in environment, inequities in job opportunities and in education, and realize how many of those things are tied into racial inequities too. And then when you combine that with anger, over the George Floyd incident and other racial incidents in this country, not just police related, but in general, when you look at the racial climate in the country, of course, we ended up having this, it was a tinderbox, that was set off this summer. And I think big picture, I've been thinking about this. I feel like on the one end, because we've not really done the things that we need to do to reduce some of these inequities in society around like treating substance abuse or making sure that people have access to jobs or to mental health services. We've done such a poor job of that as a country. We just really have. And so on the front end, we ask teachers to deal with all these problems in our schools. Teachers are supposed to sort of be social workers and make sure that kids are getting fed and make sure that kids are getting connected to mental health services. And we're putting all this burden on teachers in our schools that really that's not really what we're there for. And we're seeing that now with COVID, where we're seeing all these services that we expect kids to get. They don't, because they're going to the schools. So we've kind of dumped a lot of that on schools. And then on the back end, we've also dumped a lot of dealing with these issues on the police too.
Yeah.
And this isn't what police officers were trained for or signed up for either, were to be the ones to deal with homelessness, with substance abuse issues, with poverty, issues that come with poverty and issues that come with lack of opportunity. And so big picture, the bill's important. These reforms are important. They're good. We need them. But big picture, the push is really to make sure that we're addressing these inequities, which, to me, it helps everybody to make sure that we're having a cleaner environment, that we're equalizing access to education, whether you're born in Belmont or you're born in Chelsea. It shouldn't make a difference. If you have the drive to succeed, you should be able to succeed educationally. Obviously, that's going to help everybody, no matter what background you are, but it's going to work on reducing those inequities, those racial inequities too. And I think that ultimately is such a huge part of this protest movement and everything that's going on in the country. So I do hope that we can use this moment to make real lasting positive change, not just when it comes to criminal justice, but when it comes to everything that sort of leads into it too.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can, address some of the inequalities in our system that have been just ignored for too long, or swept under the rug. I'm really hopeful that we can, work on issues of, particularly in housing injustice, making sure that people of color can get housing in places where they are often kept out through exclusionary zoning and issues like that. I mean, it's a policy choice that the average net worth of a Black Bostonian is $8. You know, that happened because of policy choices that were made. So I'm hopeful that we can, you know, take a good hard look in the mirror and say, yeah, there's things that we need to do, things that we need to address, that we can, you know, through this time. And if we can't do it now, I don't know when, because people seem to be really clued into the idea that, you know, Black lives do matter, and we've been kind of looking at this the wrong way. Let's see what we can do to adjust these inequalities.
Yeah, and I think that's why the reason why I make that point is, you know, because obviously, as you know, it's a flashpoint. These issues are on police reform, you know, and it's not just a policing issue, and no one's saying it's just a policing issue. I think the issues in policing are reflective of broader inequities in our society that, you know, policing is just one piece of the things that we need to fix. And so we can't sort of just wipe our hands clean and say, well, we passed this bill, we created a opportunity to license and de-license officers, and, you know, we're good. We addressed this moment. We didn't, you know, because we really have to tackle all those underlying challenges too. So that brings us to about an hour. So I wanted to see, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we say goodbye to?
I think that was about it. I think we solved it all.
We did it. We're good.
An hour. It's fine.
You know, but I think one last thing is, not only hopefully does this year give us an opportunity for legislative change, but hopefully it gives us an opportunity for political change too. You know, where there are a lot of really good, strong candidates running all over the state. I've been really excited to meet you and to meet other candidates that are running really exciting campaigns that really are trying to bring more people into the tent, you know, and create a more democratic legislature, not Democratic Party, but like small d Democratic, more inclusive and more welcoming.
I was talking to another candidate before, saying, "Oh, we're going to be the COVID class. We're all going to be so happy to like see each other. We're going to work together real great because we know how to interface online. We know how to interface in person. We're going to be able to do it all."
Exactly, and we're going to come in shaped by the fact that we ran during this year. Where everything, you know, COVID and the protests and everything that was happening. And hopefully that allows some great candidates to get elected on September 1st and in November. And B, drives us to really go into the legislature and make the kinds of meaningful changes that I know you and I both can't wait to roll up our sleeves and fight for in January.
That's right.
All right. Well, with that, I appreciate those of you who tuned in, and Steve, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. And I hope we'll be able to work together next January.
I hope so too. I look forward to it. Best of luck.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Take care.